and most importantly, how you can help with their conservation. I'm so inspired to see today's interest. We view this webinar as the first in our series of practitioner-based discussions. Welcome to this new community of Western practitioners. I'm Vicki Fenn with the Fish and Wildlife Service. I will be your host today. We have a lot of ground to cover in the next hour. First, the ground rules. We are recording this webinar. Please stay muted and off video for the entire webinar unless you are a speaker. Use the chat to enter your questions. Throughout the webinar, we will be monitoring your questions and either answering them in the chat or saving them for the question and answer session at the end. If we do not get to your question today, we will post the answers to all questions when we post the recording on the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies website. Near the end of the webinar, we will drop a short survey in the chat. Please fill out the survey and give us feedback on how we did today and topics you would like covered in the future. We have a distinguished lineup of speakers, and in the interest of time, I will let them introduce themselves at the start of their presentation. You see their names on the slide right now. So, without further ado, it is my honor to turn over the mic to Amanda Barth with the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Amanda.
Thanks, Vicki. Give me just a second. I can open my slideshow. Can you confirm that you see that?
Yes, we see it.
Thank you so much. My name is Amanda Barth, and I'm very pleased to be here today on behalf of the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies to share some exciting new information about our Western Monarch and Native Pollinator Working Group. The working group started with a focus on Western monarchs in 2017, including the 7 states in the Western Monarch range. So that's Arizona, California, Idaho, Nevada, Oregon, Utah, and Washington, plus federal and NGO partners that contributed to the development of the Western Monarch Conservation Plan. This plan outlines comprehensive conservation strategies that span habitat restoration, outreach, research and monitoring, and efforts to improve practices and policy to support monarchs and other pollinators. As part of the state's commitment to the conservation plan, the working group developed a tool to report implementation efforts by partners, the Monarch chat tool, that tracks and maps these conservation successes directly onto the Western Monarch range. Most of the Western states have limited or no statutory authority to manage native insects. So the working group has also worked with WAFWA to provide consistent messaging for the unique conservation needs of Western monarchs. As our state agency group members have received direction from their leadership, we've recognized a growing need for an expanded scope that includes other at-risk pollinators in the West. We started down this path in earnest in January of 2022 with a name change to our group that reflects our expanded scope. By using the model we developed for monarchs, we are working to identify focal species that are shared conservation priorities across state lines, leverage resources that maximize our impact through habitat-based initiatives, and gather valuable species-specific information like natural history data and population responses to restoration activity. We're still keeping our commitment to Western monarch conservation as our central priority, but this approach will emphasize their role as an ambassador species to help other native pollinators. We're really optimistic about the opportunities that this new direction will open up for collaborative efforts between state and federal partners to tackle shared priorities. One of the first major tasks of our expanded focus is developing a work plan that frames landscape-level solutions for listing prevention of target species that occur across state boundaries. This will mean utilizing regional and national databases to develop scientifically sound approaches, gathering additional data on species life cycles, habitat needs and threats, and ensuring our state and global rankings are current to help inform listing decisions. It also means committing to actions that support multiple species wherever possible, like improving habitat connectivity with corridors. and pursuing interagency opportunities for funding and cooperative agreements. This new direction is so promising because it seizes on this growing momentum around supporting pollinators, which are so fundamental to the health of the environment. Our working group is representative of this shared goal of working together to keep these species thriving so that they don't get listed. That's it for now on the working group, and I will go ahead and hand it off to Kat Darst with U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
Thanks, Amanda. Let's see. Let me know, did that work?
You're good.
Awesome. Okay, awesome. Thank you, Amanda. So good morning, everyone. I'm Kat Darst with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Ventura, California, and I'm happy to talk with you today about Western monarch butterfly population status and actions. So as you all know well, the monarch migration is an amazing phenomenon. In the spring, adults migrate from wintering grounds in Mexico for the eastern population. So that's shown here as the blue dot down there in Mexico. And then from coastal California for the western population, shown as the blue polygon here along the California coast. So that's where they're overwintering. And then through several generations, these butterflies migrate as far north as Canada. And then adults, 3 or 4 generations removed from those that began the trip in the spring, they travel the entire distance back to the wintering grounds in the fall. And then these are the monarchs that will begin the northward migration in the following spring. So monarch butterflies have expanded across the globe, where they've become naturalized in 29 countries. However, the ancestral origins for monarchs worldwide are these long distance migratory populations found in eastern and western North America. So the wintering western monarch butterflies have seen a dramatic decline. So the east has seen a decline too, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So in the west, monarch butterflies have declined from about 1.2 million butterflies in 1997 to fewer than 2,000 butterflies in 2020, with this hopeful bump up that you can see in 2021. So the butterfly numbers are depicted as the green bars through time. And then you can see that those bars are declining, even though efforts to count the butterflies have increased, which is shown by the blue line on the graph. You know, and there's no single cause for the drop in monarch numbers, particularly in the West. But there are multiple factors contributing to this long-term decline, and they include habitat loss and degradation in the overwintering groves and in the breeding areas, pesticides, disease, and a change in climate. And so due to this set of threats, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has placed the monarch butterfly on the candidate list, with reevaluation of its listing status scheduled for 2024. And so while we're really excited about the increase in Western monarch numbers from 2020 to 2021, we have had over 200,000 overwintering butterflies in California as recently as 2017, you know, and we can see from the graph what happened after that. And for some additional context, estimates indicate that in the 80s, there may have been 4.5 million overwintering butterflies on the California coast. So while we're really excited about this return to over 200,000 Western monarchs this year, and it's really something to celebrate, I think we should just put it in context and understand that the future viability of migratory Western monarchs and many other at-risk butterfly species depends on continued conservation action. So real quick, why was 2021 so much better for Western migratory monarchs than 2020? And, you know, the answer is that we really don't know. There's lots of hypotheses. It's probably a multifaceted combination of things. So, but a couple of these could be, because monarchs have 3 to 4 generations a year, you know, their capacity to increase is really large. So if milkweed availability, timing, and growth are just right, a female monarch can produce a lot of offspring. And so milkweed availability could have been good because of small population size effects, good environmental conditions that contributed to an early spring bloom. It also may have been that 2021 saw a decrease in threats to monarchs, such as maybe fewer fires in important breeding areas, less pesticide use, or cooler fall temperatures. And another possibility is that the West may have seen an influx of migrants from the eastern population or from Arizona during the fall migration. And, maybe that influx was more noticeable than normal due to small population size. So whatever the reason, we're really grateful that so many monarchs overwintered in California this year. Next, I'd just like to tell you about a few conservation efforts in the West that might be of interest to the group. So first, here is the Western Monarch Butterfly Conservation Plan developed by WAFWA that Amanda mentioned. This plan currently encompasses California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. So those are the states that comprise the core of the Western Monarchs range. The plan includes short-term plans for protecting and managing important overwintering sites, providing additional monarch-friendly habitat in the breeding range, education and outreach, and research and monitoring. So this plan, as Amanda mentioned, it's a great resource for agencies and organizations looking to contribute to that bigger picture of Western monarch recovery. So also, partners have been working to identify priority action zones for recovering Western monarchs. So California, as shown on the map here, it includes priority 1 and priority 2 areas. The west of the West is considered priority 3. So priority 1 includes this light blue breeding and migratory habitat, and then the dark brown overwintering habitat along the California coast. So in the priority 1 overwintering areas, we recommend protection and restoration of overwintering habitat and the planting of native nectar plants to really support that overwintering generation. And then the light blue area is the Western monarch's early breeding zone, where butterflies make their first stop when they come off the overwintering zones. And here we are recommending protecting and planting pesticide-free early season native milkweed and nectar plants to really boost monarch numbers during the first and second generations. So the population viability analysis suggests that if we can really up the habitat for monarchs in these areas, that's where we'll get the biggest bang for our buck in terms of creating more monarch butterflies in the West. And then my last thing, so given that the species is now a candidate for listing under the Endangered Species Act, and it'll be reevaluated nationally for listing in 2024, the Fish and Wildlife Service has developed what we're calling Section 7 recommendations for Western monarchs that can help the service and our federal partners really get a jump on conservation for this species. So it's a October 2021 document, and I'm happy to share it with anyone that's interested. So finally, overall, what Western monarchs really need is for us to do just a few things. One, protect and restore overwintering groves along the California coast. Plant native insecticide-free milkweed and nectar plants in breeding habitat, especially early season flowering plants and milkweed in the coastal hills and Central Valley of California. To not plant non-native tropical milkweed because it can result in year-round breeding, parasite load buildup, and the loss of the migratory behavior. They need us to protect them and their habitats from pesticides, particularly insecticides, and to contribute to the Western monarch sightings database and survey efforts, kind of, to help us better understand population dynamics. And Emma Pelton will be talking more about this topic later this morning. So with that, thanks so much for letting me talk to you about what's going on with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Western monarchs. I think there's time for questions later in the session, and it is my pleasure to turn it over to Jeff Everett, who will talk with us about bumblebees.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Jeff Everett. I'm a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Service, Oregon Fish and Wildlife Office in Portland. And I'm going to cover a couple of topics today, briefly covering on some of the things that are happening with bumblebees in the Western United States. First, a quick update. Why is my slide not advancing? Let's try that. There we go. One of the first bumblebees to be petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act was the Franklin's bumblebee, which was just added as an endangered species without critical habitat in September of last year. The only other listed bumblebee is the rusty patch bumblebee, which was petitioned in 2013, listed in 2017, and we are currently working on recovery implementation for that species. We've also been petitioned to list a yellow-banded bumblebee, and a status review of that species determined that it was not warranted for listing at this time. We have also been petitioned to list 3 other bumblebees. The one many of you are familiar with is the western bumblebee. That was petitioned in 2015, and we are currently wrapping up the draft species status assessment, which I will touch on here in a little bit more detail in a moment. We've also been petitioned to list Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee, which is a cuckoo bee, and somewhere between 70 to 90% of the prey or host base for Suckley's is actually western bumblebee. And so as westerns have declined across the range, so have Suckley's. I don't believe we've seen a Suckley's in Oregon in the last 4 or 5 years. The Fish and Wildlife Service has also been petitioned to list the American bumblebee, or Bombus pennsylvanicus, which is a very widespread North American bumblebee. That one isn't on the national listing work plan, but we did find that the petition was contained supporting evidence to proceed with a status review. So that's out a little bit further in the national listing work plan, which I will also touch on briefly here in a minute. And so across those species, I wanted to mention that since the Endangered Species Act was enacted in 1973, over 1,600 species have been added in various forms as listed as endangered or threatened. But out of all of those, only 9 bees have been listed, and only 2 of those are bumblebees, Franklin's and rusty patch. The other are yellow-faced bees in Hawaii. I wanted to point out also that we were just recently petitioned to list the Mojave poppy bee, which is narrow endemic. It'll touch on several of the western states. Folks that are present at today's webinar as well may be affected by that in the future. And so that one's not on the national listing work plan yet either, but it's coming. And so there's a lot happening, but there's also, with bumblebees in particular, and bees in general, they don't have a lot of case history or conservation history with the Endangered Species Act as compared to species that have been the subject of ESA protections for decades and mountains of research in some cases. And I'll use bull trout and grizzly bear and sage grouse as examples of those. There's a lot that we fundamentally just don't know about our bumblebees and some of our other bees as well, which makes applying viability assessments and bringing meaningful targeted species-specific conservation to bear in the right places at the right time much more challenging. And one of the things we'd like to accomplish today is to reinforce the point that many of you can do a lot to help us with all of this kind of work. Briefly touching on the Western Bumblebee SSA, or Species Status Assessment. The SSAs are basically comprehensive biological reports that we write in partnership with a pool of experts, and there's a lot of input from outside agencies and stakeholders. And these things take years to draft. There's a lot of analysis and information that goes into these. Typically, these take quite a bit of time. And most recently with the Western Bumblebee SSA, we've had it moved out on the national listing work plan. Originally, it was going to be a fiscal year 23 species. That's just been moved to fiscal year 24 as we've shuffled things around to take better advantage of some limited capacity in the agency. And so update for many folks is that a decision on this species won't be coming in fiscal year 23. It has been pushed out to fiscal year 24. However, we are also going to start the peer and partner review of the draft SSA document here in the next month or so. So stay tuned for more on that. If anybody has questions on the Western Bumblebee, please reach out to me anytime. And I also wanted to reinforce the point that the species status assessment is not itself a decision document. Rather, it supports decisions by being a comprehensive biological report that also includes a viability assessment for the species, both currently and into the future. And so it provides the biological foundation upon which a decision about the species status can be made, along with additional supporting information. I also wanted to briefly touch on Franklin's bumblebee, which many folks have contributed to. We still don't have it on the landscape in populations that we know where they are. It hasn't been seen in the wild since 2006, but there is a lot of really high quality habitat available for the species that has not been surveyed. And so we are continuing to develop tools to refine and prioritize our search effort. We're also developing new tools like eDNA and a variety of other things to help improve where we're looking and when. And so there's a lot of good things happening for Franklin's. We continue to work on a wide variety of projects with our state and federal partners across the very narrow range of the species, primarily those 3 counties in Southern Oregon and 2 in Northern California. And we're anxiously looking forward to field season, as we have a couple of seasonal students and a wide variety of partners that are going to be helping us with the survey effort again this year. Bumblebee conservation is tricky. There is not any one particular thing that is influencing the widespread decline of many of these pollinators. We know a little bit about how all these different threats work on the species, but the interaction between some of these stressors is very complicated and poorly understood. And so we can't single-handedly point to disease or habitat loss or invasive annual plants or agricultural changes on the landscape. Rather, what's driving a lot of the declines we've seen is a very complicated synergistic effect, where it's multiple stressors acting on the species at the population scale at once. And so there's a lot we can do to mitigate some of these threats and start steering things in a positive direction. And when we start doing good things, as Kat was describing for monarchs, we're also doing good things for a wide variety of other pollinators as well. And so there's a lot we can help, a lot that everybody can do to help with a lot of this kind of stuff. And there's much more information available on this, both for Franklin's bumblebee, Western bumblebee, and a wide variety of our pollinators. Reach out anytime if people need help with this sort of thing. Almost a bit more urgently, we need help filling some of the information gaps on where our pollinators currently are. This is one of the range maps for Western bumblebee, including a description of the analytical units from the forthcoming draft Western Bumblebee Species Status Assessment. And you can see from this, there's a number of places where we fundamentally don't have really good information on presence, absence, or abundance over time. This makes the analysis that we do in the SSAs, and that, again, which supports the listing decisions, very complicated. And so there are vast places in the range of the species where we could use help filling some of these information gaps, conducting surveys, and even negative surveys is valuable information. There's a lot of work that can be done here, and we'd like your help with quite a bit of it. The other thing that's come out recently as a more complicated threat, we're just beginning to wrap our heads around this, is the role that managed bees, and I'll use that term broadly, and the way they impact our native pollinator communities. And so the forthcoming Western Bumblebee SSA has a pretty lengthy chapter on the complexities associated with managed bees, how they move across the landscape, and the complex threats they place. And this information is somewhat dated here, but I wanted to use this just as a brief illustration. I want you to pay attention to this purple dashed line here. And in any one growing season, we have managed bees that move from a variety of crops in California, Central Valley stuff, all the way up to support upper Midwest seasonal crops, and then back over to the Pacific Northwest for things like apples late in the season. This is a great way to impact species from a competition point of view, from native pollinators that don't move across the landscape in this way, but it's also a really good way to move disease across the landscape, especially broad spectrum diseases that impact a wide variety of our pollinators. And so this is a complex problem that we don't have a really good handle on, and it's going to take a lot of work to address in scales that are meaningful for many of our wide-ranging species. One of the things we'd like everybody's help on this year is keeping an eye on, or an eye out, excuse me, for the common eastern bumblebee, which is an eastern bumblebee species that's used for a wide variety of commercial pollination services and has been recently exported to the western United States, as well as Alaska and Canada, Western Canada. And we're trying to keep an eye out for these. If you encounter them in the wild, please let us know. And so, as I've said multiple times, there's a lot that everybody can do to help with all of plugging these information gaps and keeping track of things that are happening out there on the landscape as we dive enthusiastically into field season. The first thing is we want everybody's help supporting the incredibly important atlas and survey projects. These things are foundational to our decision-making process and plug information gaps that we all rely on in an effort to do good things for our pollinators. We also want people to help us report sightings of our target species, the good and the bad. If you find Franklin's bumblebee, please call me. Same thing with Suckleys. And if you find the common eastern bumblebee in western Montana, please let us know. And critically important, I can't emphasize this enough, please sanitize your survey equipment. By trying to do good things for pollinators and plug these information gaps and conduct surveys and find our target species, we don't want to be inadvertently exacerbating a very tricky problem and spreading contamination or potentially disease throughout our native pollinator communities. There's a lot of resources available for this. If anybody has questions, please let me know. And with that, oh, I have one more slide. I wanted to let everybody know that last year, the service began an interactive mapper and pollinator restoration project across all of the western states. Projects were originally compiled from existing databases, primarily the Western Monarch Conservation Database and the U.S. Forest Service's Watershed Improvement Tracking Database. And our request is that if your agency or organization has information that could be used to build up the database, please let Alan know. This is a voluntary effort, but the more information that's in it, the better the tool will be for all of us. So thank you in advance, and I will turn it over to Emma.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm just going to pull up my presentation. All right. There we go. All right, thanks for being here today. Thank you all for tuning in. We're now going to shift a little bit and focus on really trying to get you all who are out in the field or recreating on your own time, kind of the tools you need to report monarchs, milkweeds, and then followed by my coworker Rich about bumblebees. So trying to bring this home so you can come away with ways that you know you can report. So I'm going to be focusing on how to report monarchs and milkweeds in the West. And we define the West really broadly. Right now we're talking any Rocky Mountain states in West. So even if you're a little bit east of the Rocky Mountains, like in Colorado or Montana or Wyoming, you can still report. So the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper is a really large database and community science effort that was built over many years by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, by states, including Idaho Department of Fish and Game, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and is now housed by us at Xerces. And we had funding from NIFWIF and other funders. So it was really coming out of a need to have a one-stop shop for really high quality information about where we find milkweed on the landscape in the West and where we find monarchs of all life stages. So we've got this really nice interactive map. You can go and check it out. I've got the address there, monarchmilkweedmapper.org. and you can directly report records. You can also view and download records. We have a little technical glitch right now with our KML download, but we're going to fix that. Otherwise, you can download the CSV right now. So you can actually look at about 50,000 records of milkweed and monarchs in the West. You can overlay it with lands that you're managing or interested in. So really a one-stop shop, publicly accessible. And we're going to focus on, there are many ways you can report to this project besides just the website, but I'm going to focus on just one that's really relevant, and that's using the iNaturalist app. And we have a Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper project within iNaturalist. If you are already familiar with iNaturalist, that's great. You're one of over 2 million users. And I also wanted to point out that iNaturalist is available in 37 languages, at least according to Wikipedia. So it's really nice. You don't have to have a particular app for every project that you develop. You can use iNaturalist and then make a project, and then it really transfers across languages and countries. So for our purposes, we're just talking about the Western United States.
Okay, am I the only one that lost Emma's sound?
No, I can hear Emma just fine.
I can hear.
Oh, sorry about that, Vicky.
Emma, I think we lost your sound for just a bit there.
Vicky, I think that we can all hear it. Maybe it was something on your end.
Yep.
Okay. Everybody else could hear it. It was just my end.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear it.
Thanks
Okay,
for checking though, Vicky.
Thanks.
There's always technical glitches, so thanks for confirming. Yeah, so if you don't already have the app, you can use any way that you download apps on your device. And you're going to go in, it's free. You're going to look for this iNaturalist logo to make sure you've got the right one. You can also use a web browser, inaturalist.org. And I should point out that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the states, Xerces, we are not part of iNaturalist. I'm just giving them a free advertisement in this webinar. It's run by California Academy of Sciences and National Geographic. And essentially, you just need a device that can take a photo. So you're going to take a photo of that animal you see in the field. Let's say it's a monarch caterpillar. You're going to upload it to this project, which allows other people to see that record. And then there's also a really nice platform where you can actually discuss and people can help you ID and verify that you found the species that you think you found. So just to do this kind of a step-by-step, if you're not familiar with this application, you're going to install it and then you're going to open it. You're going to see this blank screen and you're going to go to the lower right and you're going to say, I want to make an observation. You're then going to get to select which sort of camera function you'd like to use. Or if you already have a photo, you can select a photo you maybe took last week. This is an example of camas in my yard because my milkweed is not above ground yet here in Portland, Oregon. So I took a photo of camas, and then I'm going to fill out some fields to say what I found. I can try to identify it. If you're not sure the species, you can say, okay, I know this is milkweed, so this is Asclepias. You can put in the date or the location. So again, if you're not at the location that you took the photo, you can modify that. You could name it the field site that means something to you so you can go back and know that that's where you found it. And then you're going to add it to that Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper project at the bottom of that field. I should also point out you can also note if it's captive or cultivated. So in this case, I planted this camas in my yard. I would note that because that might inform how researchers would use the data. So you're then going to add that project. And why this is really an important step if you have the time is because it allows us to ask you some additional questions. So let's say you took a photo of a milkweed, but you also saw an adult flying. You also saw nectaring going on. You saw threats to the site. You can really fill in some additional information that can be really valuable. So there are a lot of places to report monarchs and milkweeds. If you're in that world, you may already have other projects that you report to. We're not here to convert you to this project necessarily. I think the most important thing is to report, but this is really a project where we can kind of gather that additional information that can be really valuable and is really the one-stop shop that I think the service is using, that a lot of state agencies are using. We've had tribes reach out, we've had DOTs reach out. We know a lot of people are trying to use this information, and this is the place where they are going to download that data and apply it. Most recently, I had Grand Canyon National Park reach out, and they're going to take these observations and they're going to overlay it when they think about management and where to do surveys on their national park. And then finally, you're going to be able to view those observations. You're going to see that nice photo. You're going to see that location, those details. You can see what other people have reported, and you're actually going to have this map of the whole West that shows these different observations. And so it might be really, hopefully motivating if you're out in Eastern Washington to see that we have very few in our project in Eastern Washington, and we would love observations out there. So again, this is just one way to report, but it's really a handy way, and you can use this for many other species besides monarchs and milkweeds. I'd like to make a little plug that, we know monarchs are kind of this ambassador species. As Amanda said, this is something people are excited about and tend to be a little bit more easy to identify. But we would love reports of other butterflies, not to our specific monarch milkweed project, but there are other websites you can report to. You can report to iNaturalist, you can report to eButterfly. Another one to plug is Butterflies and Moths of North America. If you've got a really tricky one to ID, that tends to be a more specialized group of people helping with that ID. And this is all really important because studies have shown that we've seen these declines in many of our widespread butterflies across the West, not just monarchs. And then my final thing I wanted to say, if you're out there in the field and you're busy and you saw a monarch fly by and you didn't get a photo, you're going to say, well, can I not report this? The short answer is we really want to have really good quality control for our data set. That's why it's being used by so many partners. So we really want a photo, but if you're a biologist who's regularly doing surveys and you can show us that you know what you're talking about because you've reported multiple by showing us that photo, there's an Excel option on our website, and you can email us at monarchs@xerces.org if you can't find it easily. But there's a way that you can kind of fill out that form without a photo. We just need to verify that you kind of know what you're looking at and have maybe reported otherwise with photos, because you'd be surprised how many swallowtails and painted ladies and other animals that we get reported. So we'd like to vet that. But if you're already out doing surveys and you have your own method that you're collecting data and you can't get that photo, or that butterfly is moving really quickly, we understand and we can work with you. So please reach out if you have questions. And with that, I will stop presenting and I will turn it over to my colleague, Rich Hatfield.
Great. Thanks, Emma. Can you just confirm that you can see my slides?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Rich Hatfield. I'm a senior conservation biologist for the Xerces Society based in Portland, Oregon. Work alongside Emma and our whole team. I'm here to talk to you today about bumblebee watching, which is something that, as you learned from Jeff Everett, is very important as we move forward. And I'm going to talk about some of the various efforts that are out there and available for you to contribute your observations, as well as a little bit of information about why we're doing this and how we're using this information. So jumping right in here, why do we need to monitor, bumblebees? And I think it's important to recognize that, and I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit here. I'm sure most of you know this information, but we just don't have the baseline data sets that we have for, say, mammals and birds out there. And, thankfully, the gentleman that you see on this slide here, Dr. Robin Thorpe, was monitoring bumblebees in Northern California and Southern Oregon in the mid-1990s when the Western bumblebee and Franklin's bumblebee started to disappear. And I wonder where we would be if he wasn't doing that research. At what point we would have actually learned, that there was something going on with those particular bumblebee species, and then with bumblebees in North America. So having baseline data at a continental scale is incredibly important for these broadly distributed, really important pollinating animals that are on the landscape. In addition to baseline data sets, there are a lot of researchers now that are using modeling efforts to look at the effects of future climate change and other things on bumblebees and other taxa. And this is a paper that came out in 2020 that was looking at the effects of climate change on bumblebees and the potential, loss in species richness, over time. But when you, dig a little deeper, and so this is the result of the model, but when you dig a little deeper and look at the underlying data set, there's a lot of blue on this map that shows the monitoring efforts, sort of, especially in the center of the country and in the Intermountain West, are lacking. We really don't have great data for what's going on with bumblebees out there on the landscape. And so this certainly, I know that the model corrected for this lack of sampling in some areas, but obviously having better sampling is going to help us be more predictive in the future for conservation action. And additionally, as Jeff mentioned, data is incredibly important for regulatory decisions. This is an occupancy model that was developed by Tabitha Graves and colleagues that was developed for the species status assessment for the Western bumblebee. And having better data here would provide a more accurate model and allow us to predict how this species will be faring in the years ahead. And likewise, as Jeff mentioned, particularly with Franklin's bumblebee, if we don't know where these animals are living on the landscape, it's very hard to enact conservation action. So learning where these animals are living and what habitats they're using and the flowers that are important to them are incredibly important as we think about conservation action moving forward. Thankfully, over the last 20 years or so, we have learned that community science works to monitor bumblebees. Bumblebees, thankfully, unlike a lot of other bee species, are fairly readily identified from photographs. And so having a team of people out on the landscape that are trained with cameras is a wonderful way to monitor bumblebees. And this slide is a good example of that. The figure that you see in the middle here was a figure that was put out in 2011 by Sydney Cameron and her team, and it shows the surveying effort they had for the western bumblebee at that time. And everywhere that you see a yellow circle on that graph is where her team was out looking for bumblebees. And everywhere that you see an orange pie is where they actually detected the western bumblebee. So they were specifically looking for the western bumblebee. And you can see even though this was a fairly large team, I think 8 to 12 biologists were out on the landscape searching these areas, they were unable to find the western bumblebee up and down the west coast, as well as on the far eastern fringes of its range. But if you look at this map on the right, these are community science efforts where we've had a lot of people, and not just 8, but hundreds or even thousands of people on the landscape looking for this species. And you can see that community scientists have been able to detect this species and inform conservation action over the last 15 years or so. So some really important observations have come from community scientists. When we think about when to look for bumblebees, we really want to be out in the landscape when things are in peak bloom. The figure that you see here on this slide is basically the bumblebee life cycle, with winter or early spring on the far left and fall on the far right. And in the early spring, it's only queens that are on the landscape, and then they will slowly build up their colony size so that there will be lots of workers that are available and active on the landscape come midsummer. And that's when we want to be out looking for these animals so that we can detect them. Some species emerge earlier, some later, particularly the cuckoo bumblebees that Jeff briefly mentioned sometimes have a little bit different phonology. So this is just a general guidance out there. Once we're looking, how do we get clear photos? If you want to get a good in situ photo of a bee on a flower like you see on the left here, it just takes a lot of patience. For ID, the best thing to do is to capture the bee and follow a capture, chill, and photograph protocol. What this means is that you would capture the bee using an insect net and transfer the bee into a clean jar. You would then put the jar into a cooler with ice, and then leave the bee on ice for 5 to 10 minutes when it would be cold anesthetized, so essentially just available for clear photographs. Bees can safely stay in the cooler for up to 120 minutes, so up to 2 hours, probably longer than that, but that's a safe amount of time. And then you can take super detailed photos, and I'll show you what some of those detailed photos can look like and which ones to take in the slides to come. And then you would release the bee into the shade within 100 meters of the capture location. And then finally, as Jeff mentioned, between bees, it's a really good idea to sterilize your survey equipment. And you can use either an alcohol solution or a diluted bleach solution to do this. Which photographs do we need to effectively identify bumblebees? Some species we can identify quite readily from almost any photo, but to make sure that we can identify the bumblebees in your photo, particularly if you're practicing this capture, chill, photograph and release method, we need to see a photo that clearly shows the head. And what we ideally need to see here is the hairs on the front of the face and the hairs on the top of the head. So the front of the face would be sort of here, and then the top of the head is actually up above the eyes, almost where it meets the thorax. It's also ideal if we can see the cheek length, so have some idea of how much space is below the eye. Getting that level of detail is best, especially if you have an anesthetized bee. Then we also want to see a photo that shows the thorax, and we need to see what's in front of the wings, what's between the wings, and what's behind the wings, and ideally what's also below the wings. And then we also need to see a photograph that shows all of the tergal segments. Tergal segments are the name of the segments on the abdomen. And we need to see a photo that shows all 6 of those. So ideally, we don't want to see the wings obscuring the color patterns, because we need to see sometimes what's going on in the middle of the segments, as well as what's going on the edge. So those are basically the photos that we need. As long as we can see the head clearly, the thorax clearly, and the abdomen clearly, we can usually make a determination, at least for female bumblebees. If you have an anesthetized bee, it's really important to check your photographs and make sure that they're clear and in focus and well lit. The photos that you see here, while the one on the far left is fairly well lit and you can see some of those features, the other 3 are either out of focus or too dark to really see what's going on, and it makes it really hard to make a determination. So if you've gone through all of this effort to capture the bee and chill it and anesthetize it, it's really important to make sure that you're getting good, clear photos. And if you need to, you can go ahead and put your finger in there to pull the wings aside to get the photo that you need. Once you have these photos, it's a question of where you should be sharing them. And there are a number of options out there. Emma was just talking about iNaturalist, and if you're already active on iNaturalist and you want to share stuff there, I think that's fine. Eventually, the Bumblebee data will end up in the same database and will get used. But I think there's a reason for us to recommend Bumblebee Watch over iNaturalist for bumblebees. And there's 2 reasons for that. One, iNaturalist obscures the exact location for imperiled species. And so you can't get the exact latitude and longitude out of that database for those imperiled species. And also, the expert-based verification system that we use on Bumblebee Watch is just more accurate, generally speaking, than the community-sourced verification system that iNaturalist has. I will say this has gotten much better. Dr. John Asher, over the last couple of years, has been very active on iNaturalist, but there's no telling how long that would last. So if you're looking for a new platform, we would recommend that you submit your photos to Bumblebee Watch, which is an expert-verified system. And just a quick tutorial on Bumblebee Watch, you can go to bumblebeewatch.org, log in, and then you'll choose record a sighting and choose Bumblebee sighting. And then at the top of that, you'll choose your project. Most folks would just be choosing Bumblebee Watch here, unless you're in one of our states that has an Atlas program. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then you're going to search for a location. And if you've already submitted an observation at that location, you can use the top box there and just type in the same name, and it would automatically enter the latitude and longitude. If it's a new site, you need to give it a site name, and then you can either use the Google search to find the location, or you can interact with the map by either zooming with a scroll or with the buttons that you see there, and then clicking on the map to enter the latitude and longitude and state. Or you can manually enter the latitude, longitude, and state. You just need to use decimal degrees and include the leading negative sign for longitude that we use in the Western Hemisphere. And then finally enter the date and the location for accuracy. And then on the next page, you'll drag your photos and upload them into that box, or you can use the choose files and use Windows Explorer, whatever computer system that you're using to select the photos. You can choose the species and enter the floral host here if you know it. And then if you want to add another species or another observation at that site, you can click Add Another, and it would open up a window to basically submit a checklist of all the bees that you saw in that location. If you're not sure of the species and you want to use our identification tool, you can click on that, and it will, And then for sensitive species, you can click this private box, and that would obscure the observation from the map, but still make the exact latitude and longitude available to conservation practitioners. This is what our identification guide looks like. You'll essentially be able to look at your photo and then select what the face, thorax, and abdomen look like, and it narrows down your choices. And then you can select which species that you think it is. But ultimately, the sightings are verified by bumblebee taxonomic experts. It's important for me to let you know that I think you should be submitting observations of all bumblebees and not just rare ones. Because we don't have population level data, we often use relative abundance as a proxy for population status. And so if we are only entering rare species into the database, it can actually make those rare species look artificially common. So we want to also be keeping track of what's happening with those rare species so that we have sort of the background information of what's going on with bumblebees in general. It also will just allow us to track those species and provide early warning signs for the long run. And this is a good time for me to just jump in and say, because of these issues, we have really started to focus a lot of our efforts on doing these systematic surveys throughout states. So we've launched a number of Bumblebee Atlas projects in the West, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. So if you're in Oregon, Washington, or Idaho, or now in California, we have these systematic atlas where folks are following a standardized protocol and capturing all bumblebees that they see, and then submitting all of those data to Bumblebee Watch. If you'd like to learn more about that program, you can go to the URL at the top of the page there, bumblebeeatlas.org. And if you're interested in expanding into a state that we're not currently in, please feel free to reach out to me. We'd be happy to have a conversation with you about what that would look like. And just to show you a little bit about why that matters, the map that you see here, there's 3 species of interest here. Morrison's bumblebee, the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis, and Bombus impatiens. And we can see where those species are in the landscape, but more importantly, we don't have to guess whether, say, the western bumblebee has been found in this area or whether anybody's looked. Every square that you see here is actually a place where a survey was conducted, but these species were not detected. And having those zeros or lack of detection information is incredibly important for the regulatory decisions that Jeff was talking about and the long-term conservation decisions that we're making as practitioners. So these Atlas projects are really great for that. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like, you know, when we start an Atlas project, which is when you see the state turns green, you can see that it really starts to change the way that data are collected. Typically, you know, in much of the country, especially in the West, bumblebee observations follow transportation corridors and population centers. And so these Atlas projects encourage people to get outside of those areas and do these standardized surveys so that we can fill in the survey gaps that are out there. And with that, I will say thank you very much for your time. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about any of this. And then I will turn this back over to Vicki.
Thank you so much, presenters. That was an amazing wealth of information. We are so grateful for what you provided. We're going to pop the survey in the chat right now. So please, listeners, take a look at it and fill it out for us. We really want to hear back from you, your feedback on this. But now I want to turn it over quickly now to as many questions as we can answer before the top of the hour. And if we need to go over a little bit at the top of the hour, we will. So I'm turning it over to Alan to give us the first questions.
Thanks everyone for putting so many questions in the chat. Saw a lot of them are getting answered along the way, but a few that we can provide some more details on. And Rich, this first question's for you, one of our final ones in the chat here. Someone's asking about Bumblebee Watch and wondering how they can get their observations verified by an expert. They put in some submissions in 2021, and we're wondering if the Bumblebee Watch lets the user know that their photo has been looked at by an expert.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because it is an expert verified system, there are a limited number of us that have the capacity and ability to do this. And because of our Atlas projects, I think I got 9,000 observations of bumblebees in Oregon, Washington, Idaho last year that I was prioritizing and verifying. And so some of the other states in the West may not have gotten those, but they're still in our queue and they will be gotten to. It does just take some time, but we will get to them. But it does take longer than, say, you would see on iNaturalist, where you just have hundreds of people that are looking at them and putting some ID on them. But the problem with that system is, there's a lot of novices out there that are learning and getting better, but often we end up, if just two people agree with a verification, it ends up as a museum quality record. But those are, in my experience, there are many that are incorrect there. So there's a trade-off between quick feedback and longer term, what I see as a better data set. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, Rich. This next, well, there was a lot of interest in the Section 7 document for the Western Monarch, and Kat and Emma addressed that in the chat, but I figured I'd like to give them an opportunity to talk about the availability of the Section 7 document. So I'll open the floor to them to chat a little bit about that.
Sure, Alan, this is Kat. I mean, I think there's not a lot more to add to that, except that the link is in the chat. Xerces has it posted on their website, so that's probably the easiest thing. You can also email me and I can send you a PDF, but you can get the PDF from the website that's in the chat. Thanks.
Perfect, thank you. Rich, I think this is another question for you. Someone was asking about if there's a standard protocol for equipment sanitation for preventing disease transfer to our native pollinators. I know you described it just a little bit in your talk, but if there's a standard protocol you can direct us to, or maybe provide some more detail on what you do to sanitize your equipment.
Yeah, we, as I mentioned, using either alcohol or a diluted bleach solution is the best way to do this. We do have some guidance about the best ways to do this on our California Bumblebee Atlas page. I don't have that link handy, but we can send it out afterwards and get that guidance out to you. Jeff, I'm not sure if there's specific guidance that that you all have put out about the best ways to do this. What I do is just in between surveys, I use just a bleach solution and I sterilize them and then just let them air dry afterwards. And when I'm in the field, one of the benefits of COVID is it's made a lot of sterilizing equipment fairly readily available. And I have some alcohol wipes that I bring with me out in the field. And after I take a bee out, I just use an alcohol wipe and then let it air dry. And those are the things that I use during a survey and then between surveys.
Thank you, Rich. A question I think maybe open up to the group as a whole. Someone's asking about thoughts about burning meadows as a restoration tool, and how can you avoid killing bumblebees, or can you, if doing a meadow restoration using burning?
I can take a first stab at this. I think generally speaking that a controlled burn, which are generally pretty low temperature, is probably a fairly safe thing to do for bumblebees, whether they're nesting or overwintering. Most bumblebees nest under the ground, and a fairly low temperature burn probably they'd be protected from, or mostly protected from. And the same with overwintering bumblebees, they would be protected from them. And the long-term benefits, providing flowering resources would probably outweigh, any potential cost for that. I think the important thing to do with this is, if you're going to burn an area, is to not burn the entire area in one swoop. So, if the fire naturally leaves skips, it's best to not go back and try to burn those, and leave some flowering resources immediately on the landscape, because Bumblebees have a very long life cycle and need food throughout that life cycle to produce the reproductive members of the colony. So, it takes basically not till fall has that colony actually reproduced, even though there may be, several hundred individuals in there. So timing things in the late fall is probably the best idea for that reason, and making sure to leave some flowering resources on the landscape, ideally only burning about 1/3 of an area and leaving any skips. Those would be my recommendations. And we have a guide that we put out a number of years ago. It's called Conserving Bumblebees that talks about land management with the bumblebee life cycle in mind. I'll try to grab a link to it right now and put it in the chat.
Kat, it looks like we have one question for you quickly before you need to take off, but it's regarding safe harbor agreements. We have someone who's looking to plant a lot of milkweed on a property, but it looks like that for monarchs, since they're a candidate species, they're looking like they can't get a safe harbor agreement yet for them. They're wondering if Fish and Wildlife Service is considering expanding use of safe harbor agreements for habitat plantings, maybe for candidate species, but are there plans for it if the monarch does get listed as a threatened and or endangered species?
So Alan, Kat had to leave at the top of the hour for another meeting, but Jeff, if I can put you on the spot, I don't know if you heard the question about the status of safe harbors for candidate species. I know there's been some discussions in the agency about that, but we can also provide more information on the WAFWA website when we post this recording if we don't get everything covered today, for those of you who are also dropping off right now. But we're going to stay on to answer this question and a few others if people can stay on with us. Go ahead, Jeff, if you can.
There's a variety of tools under Section 10 of the ESA that that are offered to private landowners and other entities that for exactly these kinds of purposes. I don't know that there's a specific one available, a safe harbor agreement for Western monarchs in this precise geography, but Kat would be able to answer that, and I'm certain we can follow up.
We'll definitely make sure that gets on the website. Back to you, Alan. For those who can keep staying on, thank you. Please make sure you fill out those surveys before you go. Thank you.
Jeff, this next question might be for you as well. Someone was interested in the distribution for the Franklin's bumblebee. I think you had a map up, and they're wondering if shapefiles were available for Franklin's bumblebee.
Yes, send me an email. My address is right there on the screen, and I can share with you a couple of different shapefiles depending on what you're after. I have one that depicts the historic range of the species as best we understand it. I also have the historical observations and some new tools we've recently developed to support the Section 7 consultation process, as well as prioritizing some of the survey areas. So, yeah.
And I think this next question, sort of a bigger question, it's from Jennifer Jones, but I'll open it up to the whole panel there. They're wondering what are some actual changes in practices or policies that have been enacted to address the threats to pollinators. She acknowledges that it's a big question, but they're looking for some examples.
Anybody want to take a stab at that?
I might be able to offer a little insight into that. The types of guidance that is available for municipal and community management plans for, say, managing wetlands, things that efforts that take into mind monarch activity and habitat use would be following guidance that is spelled out in the Western Monarch Conservation Plan. Those kinds of things can get baked into revisions in these management plans so that the best practices can get implemented. And it just kind of starts with some awareness and word of mouth. That's kind of the seed that gets planted. Those are some of the examples that I know of, but for example, just pest management and doing fewer pesticides and more of an integrated approach. Those are the kinds of things that are changing slowly but surely.
Anybody else want to add to that? Jeff, I know you've talked a little bit about how if you're choosing a spot for restoration with climate change, it's probably better if you try to restore on the north-facing slopes where there may be a little bit more moisture and it may stay a little bit cooler. If you have those types of choices, do you want to maybe elaborate on that?
Obviously, there's a lot of variability from one site to the next, and there's a ton of interrelated and complex issues regarding climate change and drought and change in hydrologic cycles. We had 3.5 inches of rain here in a thunderstorm in suburban Portland earlier this week, to the point where my basement flooded, and that's a first. But generally speaking, to the point where we can do habitat restoration in places where we know we're going to give revegetation materials and the floral communities that support our Western pollinators a fighting chance, taking all these global things into consideration. There are restoration techniques available that can help sustain these native plants and thus the native pollinators more of a fighting chance through multiple growing seasons, especially in places where they're not in a suburban backyard where I can easily water them, after this presentation, things that are relying more on the native or the natural cycles. There's some emerging research coming out of Minnesota, I believe, where on a relatively flat landscape, they're actually creating microtopography to create north-facing slopes, but these things are only a foot tall. But they're proving through some research that this is an effective technique to give things a better fighting chance to get through the growing season and get established in that first year. And there's some work on this happening in Montana too. And it's really pretty interesting stuff. And it's not creating mountains, it's creating, micro topography, and it's shown to have some pretty interesting effects or interesting results. And so the work on that is forthcoming, and we'll certainly keep everybody in the loop on that as this webinar series continues.
Rich, this next question's for you. Someone's asking if videos are helpful for submitting bumblebee observations.
I was just typing an answer to that in the chat, but I'm happy to not have to type it out. Taking a video can be a great way to get a moving bee in focus. It's easier than taking a still photo for sure. Unfortunately, the platforms that are verifying these photos don't accept videos that I'm aware of, or at least Bumblebee Watch doesn't. I don't think iNaturalist does either. But you can often pause a video and then extract a still photo out of a video. And this is one of the methods that I often tell folks that are having a hard time taking a photograph of a bee that's flying in their landscape. So it can be effective, but you have to just work. You can either use a screenshot, or there's software that can help you extract a still out of a video. So they can be helpful, but it does take a little bit more work on the back end there.
So Alan, any further questions?
I'm looking through the chat. I think we've gotten all of them so far.
Excellent. Oh, good. Thank you. Okay, I just see one that just came in, it looks like. I can read it if you want. It says, we have had what I believe is a mold or fungus affecting the milkweed on our refuge. Who can we talk to get assistance or advise on managing milkweed issues?
This is Emma. I can drop a link in the chat and you could reach out to us. We've got some milkweed folks, and we've got a few different guidance documents that help people identify, kind of know when to address things like molds and fungus on milkweed.
Thanks, Emma. I will also pass that on to Kat. But Xerces Society has a lot of great information on their website about all of these issues in terms of how to deal with these challenges. So thank you, Xerces, for what you do. Okay, so I think in the interest of everybody's time, I think we're going to wrap up. But I really thank everyone for spending your hour with us, plus to learn how you can be part of filling these information gaps, which are so important to the decision making we have to face for these amazing insects. I hope you feel a little more confident as you embark on your 2022 field season. Everyone on this webinar is a resource for you to reach out. As I spoke earlier, we're starting this effort as this new Western group of practitioners. And we want this to be the first in a series of future webinars where maybe we dig deeper at different scales to answer your questions. And this was obviously an overview. Again, please fill out those surveys. We hope this webinar and the questions and answers and any slides will be posted soon on the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies website, as you see here. Again, if you leave your information on the survey, your email, you can become part of this growing group of Western practitioners, and we can keep you informed as more information becomes available. So with that, I thank the presenters. You did a great job. This was excellent. And of course, I couldn't leave it without saying, may the 4th be with you. Thank you for protecting our insects. It's critical what you do, and look forward to seeing you again on one of our future webinars. Thanks, everyone. Happy May.